Welcome back. I've got a special story to share today.
Yolena Carter froze as she scrolled past the photo of a freshly mounded grave, the realization of her grandmother's secret funeral hitting her like a physical blow. The image had been posted only minutes ago by Meredith Mitchell. In the photo, the Mitchell family stood against the gray backdrop of the Outer Banks shoreline, huddled under black silk umbrellas. The caption was a masterpiece of passive-aggressive exclusion, a private goodbye for our beloved matriarch. Just the immediate family, exactly as she wished. The phone felt slick in Yolena's palm. Her grandmother, Vivian, the only person who had ever truly seen her, was gone, and they had buried her like a shameful secret. An hour later, Yolena pulled her aging sedan into the crushed-shell driveway of the $2.3 million beach house. The salt air was thick and heavy, sticking to her skin as she stepped out. The house was a monument to Diane Mitchell's ambition, all white cedar shakes and wraparound porches. Today, it was lined with oversized floral arrangements that smelled of cloying lilies and expensive rot. Inside, the air conditioning was set to a bone-chilling 65 degrees. The sound of soft, mournful cello music drifted through the open-concept living room. Yolena's sensible heels clicked sharply against the polished hardwood, a jarring rhythm compared to the soft shuffling of the guests. Diane stood at the center of the room, draped in charcoal silk that shimmered under the crystal chandelier. She held a crystal glass of gin, her face a carefully constructed mask of tragic grace. She was holding court with a group of neighbors, her voice a practiced silk. It was a quiet transition, Diane was saying, her eyes dry and bright. Vivian was always so particular about her privacy at the end. Privacy or isolation? Yolena's voice cut through the curated atmosphere like a blade. The room went silent. Aunt Patty, standing near a display of framed photos, dropped her cocktail napkin. Richard Mitchell, Yolena's stepfather, stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, staring out at the Atlantic as if he could disappear into the horizon. He didn't look at his stepdaughter. He never did when Diane was in the room. Diane finally turned, her gaze raking over Yolena's modest navy blazer and the blue-gray eyes she had inherited from the man Diane spent 27 years trying to forget. "Yolena, I suppose I shouldn't be surprised. You always did have a knack for uninvited grand entrances." Meredith stepped forward then, fluttering to her mother's side. She was the golden child, the perfect reflection of Diane's grooming. But it was the object around Meredith's neck that made Yolena's blood turn to ice. It was a triple-strand pearl necklace with a sapphire clasp, Grandma Vivian's signature piece. "You're wearing them," Yolena whispered, her voice trembling with a rage she struggled to contain. "She told me those were to stay in the vault until the will was read." Meredith touched the pearls, a smirk playing at the corners of her mouth. "Mom said there was no point in letting them sit in a dark box. Besides, someone has to represent the family legacy. You look like you just came from a mid-level audit, Yolena. You wouldn't know what to do with something this fine." "The service was for immediate family," Diane added, her tone dismissive as she turned back to her guests. "We felt it was best to keep the circle small, people with complicated histories only tend to agitate the grieving process. You can leave your condolences in the foyer and find your way out." A few of the neighbors shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between Diane's designer elegance and Yolena's stiff posture. The humiliation was calculated, a public stripping of Yolena's status as a daughter. "I spent every weekend of the last 3 years with her while you were busy, rebranding the charity circuit," Yolena said, her voice dropping to a cold, dangerous level. She didn't cry. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction. Instead, her hand drifted to the pocket of her blazer, her fingers brushing against the jagged edge of a brass key and a crumpled envelope. Vivian had mailed it to Yolena's office 2 weeks ago. The handwriting had been shaky, the ink blurred by what Yolena now realized were tears. "They think I've forgotten, Yoli. They think I'm empty. Show them I still have my teeth." Harold Finch, the estate attorney, stood near the mahogany bar, his expression unreadable as he watched the exchange. He was the only one who didn't look away when Yolena caught his eye. He gave a microscopic nod, a silent acknowledgement of the storm that was brewing. The house, the estate, the accounts, it's all been handled, Yolena, Diane said over her shoulder. There's nothing here for you, there never was. Richard, show her to the door before she makes a scene. Richard didn't move. He remained a ghost against the glass. Yolena took a slow breath, the scent of the lilies no longer suffocating her. It was fueling her. She looked at Meredith, who was preening in the stolen pearls, and then at Diane, who was already laughing at a neighbor's hushed comment. You're right about one thing, Diane, Yolena said, her voice carrying across the room, stopping the cello music in its tracks. Vivian was very particular about her privacy, especially regarding her private documents. Diane paused, her glass halfway to her lips. She didn't look worried. She looked annoyed, like she was dealing with a persistent insect. Whatever nonsense you think you have, save it for someone who cares. The transition is complete. Yolena didn't argue. She didn't need to. She felt the weight of the secret she carried, the one that would turn this $2.3 million sanctuary into a cage. Vivian hadn't just left her memories. She had left a map of every lie Diane had told to build this life. I'll be at the office tomorrow morning, Harold, Yolena said, her eyes fixed on the attorney. I believe we have a specific filing to discuss regarding the beach house title. The color didn't leave Diane's face yet, but her grip on the crystal glass tightened until her knuckles went white. She laughed, a sharp, brittle sound. The title! I've owned this home for a decade, you delusional girl. Yolena smiled, and for the first time in 27 years, it was Diane who looked uncertain. We'll see who owns what when the sun comes up, Yolena said. She turned and walked out, the sound of the crashing surf outside finally drowning out the suffocating silence of the room. She didn't look back, not even when she heard the sound of a glass shattering against the hardwood floor behind her. She had 24 hours to prepare, and for the first time in her life, the sleeping lion was wide awake. The following morning, the humidity in the Outer Banks was already stifling, but the air conditioning in Harold Finch's office was set to a bone-chilling 62 degrees. Yolena Carter sat in the high-backed leather chair, her spine perfectly straight, watching the steam rise from a cup of peppermint tea she had no intention of drinking. The scent of old paper and expensive floor wax filled the room, a sharp contrast to the salt spray she'd smelled the night before. Harold Finch paced behind his mahogany desk, his fingers twitching near his silk tie. He looked like a man who had spent the last 8 hours staring at a ghost. She's been calling since 6, Yolena, he whispered, glancing at the heavy oak door as if Diane Mitchell might burst through it at any moment. She wants me to file a restraining order. She says you're having some kind of mental break. Is that what she calls it? Yolena's voice was as cool as the room. She reached into her structured leather tote and pulled out a single manila envelope. The paper was crisp, the sound of it sliding across the desk echoing like a gunshot in the silent office. Diane has spent 27 years rewriting history, Harold. She thinks if she shouts loud enough, the truth will simply stop existing. The attorney didn't pick up the envelope. He stared at it as if it were a live grenade. You have to understand my position. The Mitchell family has been my primary client for 2 decades. Your mother, she's a powerful woman in this town. She isn't my mother, Yolena corrected him, her blue-gray eyes narrowing. She's a squatter in a house that belongs to a dead woman's trust, and you're the one who helped her forge the residency requirements for the beach house title back in 2014. Harold's face went a sickly shade of gray. He sank into his chair, the leather groaning under his weight. Before he could stammer out a denial, his desk phone buzzed. He hit the speakerphone with a trembling finger, and Diane's voice filled the room, sharp and jagged as broken glass. Harold, tell me it's done, Diane Mitchell snapped. In the background, Yolena could hear the clinking of silverware breakfast at the beach house. I want that girl's things out of the guest cottage by noon. I've already told Meredith Mitchell she can use the space for her yoga studio. If Yolena shows her face on the property again, I want Marcus Webb there to handcuff her. Do you understand? She's a non-entity. Treat her like a trespasser. Yolena leaned forward, her hand hovering just inches from the phone. She could almost smell Diane's expensive French perfume through the line, that cloying lily-of-the-valley scent she used to mask everything rot-filled underneath. "I'm sitting right here, Diane," Yolena said. The silence on the other end of the line was absolute. It lasted 3 seconds, then 4. When Diane spoke again, the venom was gone, replaced by a terrifying, low-pitched simmer. "You always were a sneaky little rat hiding in corners. Listen to me carefully. You have nothing. No money, no status, and certainly no family. If you try to embarrass me, I will bury you so deep the tide won't even find you. Harold, hang up on her." The line went dead. Harold looked up, sweat beading on his forehead. "She'll do it, Yolena. She has the Mitchell Foundation behind her. The 25th anniversary gala is in 3 days. The governor is coming. She's at the height of her power." "The higher the climb, the harder the lungs burn," Yolena murmured. She stood up, smoothing the front of her modest gray blazer. She reached into her bag one more time and pulled out a small, digital recording device. She tapped the screen, showing the active recording of the call that had just ended. She just admitted to a legal eviction and threatened a witness in front of her own attorney. "What do you want?" Harold asked, his voice cracking. "I want you to look at the documents in that envelope, Harold. Really look at them. You'll find that Grandma Vivian didn't leave the beach house to Diane. She left it to the firstborn daughter of the Carter line." Diane assumed that meant her, since she'd scrubbed my birth certificate from the family Bible. But the DNA results on page 4 and the original hospital records on page 6 say otherwise. Yolena walked toward the door, her heels clicking rhythmically on the hardwood. She paused at the threshold, her hand on the brass knob. "Tell Diane I'll see her at the gala. Tell her to wear the Mitchell emeralds. I'd hate for her to look anything less than perfect when the sheriff arrives." She stepped out into the bright, blinding sun of the morning. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a text from an unknown number, but she knew the tone immediately. "Your boxes are on the curb. The trash pickup is at 11. Don't come back. Zim." Yolena didn't flinch. She looked at the clock on her dashboard. It was 9:15 a.m. She had 72 hours until the Mitchell Foundation gala, and she had one more stop to make. Aunt Patty was the only one left who remembered the night Yolena was born, and it was time for the family's oldest witness to finally stop being afraid of the dark. As she pulled out of the parking lot, she saw Deputy Marcus Webb's patrol car turning toward the beach road. The hunt had begun, but Diane Mitchell had no idea she was the one being tracked. Yolena gripped the steering wheel, her heart beating with a cold, steady precision. The countdown had started, and by the time the sun set on the gala, the Mitchell name wouldn't be worth the paper it was printed on. 40 minutes later, the air inside Aunt Patty's small cottage felt heavy with the scent of dried lavender and decades of repressed secrets. Yolena Carter sat on the edge of a velvet armchair that's seen better days, her eyes fixed on the trembling hands of the woman across from her. Patty had always been the quiet one. The sister Diane Mitchell kept on a short leash with a modest monthly allowance and the constant threat of social exile. "I kept it because I knew she'd eventually try to delete you entirely," Patty whispered, her voice cracking like dry parchment. She reached into a slit in the underside of her sewing basket and pulled out a weathered, yellowing envelope. "She thinks she burned everything. She thinks money can cauterize a memory, but I saw what she did. I saw the check she wrote." Yolena took the envelope, her fingers brushing the cool, brittle paper. Inside was a carbon copy of a bank draft from 27 years ago. It was made out to a private medical facility that no longer existed, for the exact sum of $12,000. The memo line, written in Diane's sharp, aggressive handwriting, simply read, "Disposal of records confidential." $12,000, Yolena murmured, the number tasting like copper in her mouth. That's what I was worth to her. A line item to be scrubbed. "It wasn't just the birth records, Yolena," Patty said, leaning forward, her eyes darting to the window as if she expected Diane to materialize in the garden. "She used the Mitchell Foundation's emergency fund to pay it. She embezzled from the family charity to hide her mistake. She's been sitting on a felony for nearly 3 decades, and she's so arrogant she's forgotten the paper trail exists." This was the secret power Yolena had been hunting for, the leverage that would do more than just hurt Diane's feelings. It would dismantle her empire. Yolena felt a cold, predatory calm settle over her. She tucked the envelope into her inner coat pocket, the weight of it feeling like a loaded weapon. Her phone buzzed, vibrating against her hip. She didn't have to look at the screen to know who it was. She answered, staying silent as Diane Mitchell's voice poured through the speaker, sharp and brittle as ice. "I hope you enjoyed the view of your life sitting on the curb, Yolena," Diane sneered. The sound of a clinking crystal glass echoed in the background. She was likely already at the beach house, sipping Chardonnay while the hired help prepared for the gala. "I've had the locks changed, and the security team has your photo. If you so much as breathe on the gates of this property, I'll have Deputy Marcus Webb put you in a cell before you can cry for your father. You're a ghost now, and ghosts don't own beach houses." "I heard you, Diane," Yolena said, her voice devoid of emotion. She watched a moth flutter against Patty's lampshade, trapped and frantic. "You've made your position very clear." "Good, because Meredith is wearing the Mitchell emeralds tonight for the pre-gala dinner. The ones that should have been yours if you weren't such a disappointment. Don't bother calling Richard. He's already blocked your number. We are moving on and you are finally where you belong in the trash." The line went dead. Yolena didn't flinch. She looked at Patty, who was staring at her with a mixture of pity and terror. "She has no idea," Patty whispered. "No," Yolena replied, standing up. "She thinks she's playing a game of status. She doesn't realize I'm playing a game of math." An hour later, Yolena stood in the mahogany-lined office of Harold Finch. The estate attorney was a man who moved with the deliberate slowness of a glacier, but his mind was as sharp as a razor. He laid the carbon copy on his desk, adjusted his spectacles, and let out a long, low whistle. $12,000 from the foundation account," Harold said, tapping the paper with a heavy fountain pen. "I've spent the last 2 hours cross-referencing this with the old audit logs I kept in the vault." "Diane didn't just hide your birth, Yolena. She used this donation to create a legal vacuum. By reporting you as a stillbirth in the private records she paid for, she ensured you would never inherit a dime of your grandfather's secondary trust." He looked up, his expression grim. "That trust has been accruing interest for 27 years. It's currently valued at $4.8 million. By deleting you, Diane has been skimming the dividends from that trust to fund her lifestyle. It's not just embezzlement, Yolena. It's grand larceny and identity fraud." "Can you freeze the foundation accounts?" Yolena asked. "I can do better," Harold smiled, a slow, predatory thinness to his lips. "I can file an emergency injunction that triggers an immediate forensic audit. But if we do it now, she'll have time to flee or hide assets. If we wait until the gala—" "We wait," Yolena interrupted. "I want her to be standing on that stage. I want her to be at the absolute peak of her perceived power when the floor drops out from under her." She left the office and drove toward the Outer Banks, the salt air beginning to sting her eyes as she neared the coast. She pulled her car over on a cliffside turnout overlooking the $2.3 million beach house. From this distance, the property looked like a palace of glass and light. She could see Meredith Mitchell on the wraparound balcony, draped in a silk robe, laughing as she pointed toward the ocean. Below them, a garbage truck was idling near the gates, tossing the last of Yolena's cardboard boxes into its crushing maw. Yolena gripped the steering wheel until her knuckles turned white. She watched her past being pulverized into the back of a truck, while her sister toasted to a future built on a lie. She reached into her purse and pulled out her planner. She circled the date of the gala in heavy, black ink, 48 hours. She had 48 hours to ensure that when Diane Mitchell walked onto that stage to accept her Philanthropist of the Year award, the only thing she'd be receiving was a one-way ticket to a courtroom. Yolena put the car in gear and pulled away, the grit of the sand crunching beneath her tires. The trap was set, the bait was her own silence, and Diane was too arrogant to realize she'd already stepped into the cage. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, bloody shadows over the Atlantic, Yolena felt the first spark of true, cold satisfaction. The Mitchell name was a fortress made of stolen glass, and she was about to throw the first stone. The day before the gala, The beach house smelled of lilies and desperation. The scent was cloying, thick enough to coat the back of Yolena Carter's throat as she stood in the foyer of the $2.3 million social arena. Vans from the city's most expensive florists were lined up in the driveway like a funeral procession, unloading thousands of white stargazer lilies. Diane Mitchell stood in the center of the chaos, her voice cutting through the air like a serrated blade as she directed the workers. She didn't look like a woman on the verge of a scandal. She looked like a queen preparing for her coronation. She wore a silk robe that cost more than most people's cars, her hair already pinned up in a preliminary style for the next day's festivities. When she spotted Yolena, her eyes narrowed, the warmth she reserved for the cameras vanishing instantly. "You're late," Diane snapped, checking her diamond-encrusted watch. "The catering staff needs the updated seating chart, and I won't have you lurking in the corners while the guests arrive tomorrow. You'll be in the back office, handling the silent auction tallies. Out of sight, out of mind." Yolena felt the familiar heat of a rage spike, but she kept her expression as smooth as the marble floor beneath her feet. She reached into her bag and pulled out a folder, but it wasn't the seating chart. It was a single, typed page, the legal notice of discovery she'd prepared with her ally. "I was just reviewing the guest list," Yolena said, her voice quiet and steady. She walked toward the grand piano where a portrait of the Mitchell family sat in a silver frame. She was nowhere in that photo. "It's a very impressive crowd, Diane, judges, the mayor, even the district attorney. It's the kind of audience that really appreciates a good story." Diane let out a sharp, mocking laugh. She stepped closer, the scent of her expensive, musky perfume overpowering the lilies. "A story. Is that what you think this is? This is a legacy. Tomorrow night, I am being recognized for 20 years of service to this community. I am the face of this county's grace." "Grace is easy when someone else pays for it," Yolena replied. She turned to face her mother, holding her gaze. "You should practice that speech one last time. It's important to get the tone right when you're saying goodbye." Diane's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, her brow furrowing in confusion. "Goodbye. I'm receiving an award, you fool. I'm saying hello to my future." "Legacy is a fragile thing," Yolena whispered, leaning in just enough to see the pulse jumping in Diane's neck. "It only takes one crack for the whole foundation to shift. I'd hate for you to be surprised when the floor drops out." "Cryptic doesn't suit you, Yolena," Diane hissed, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "It just makes you sound desperate. Now get to the office. Meredith is already there, and she's actually doing something useful for once." Meredith Mitchell was indeed in the office, surrounded by gift baskets and auction items. She looked up as Yolena entered, her eyes darting nervously toward the door. Behind her, Aunt Patty was checking the tags on a set of vintage pearls. The older woman paused, her hand hovering over a velvet box as she watched Yolena. There was a different energy about Yolena today, a cold, vibrating confidence that Aunt Patty recognized. It was the same look Yolena's father had carried right before he closed a major deal. It was the look of someone who knew exactly where the trap was set. "Is everything okay out there?" Meredith asked, her voice thin. "Mother sounds agitated." "She's just excited," Yolena said, sitting at the desk and opening her laptop. "It's a big night for her, the biggest of her life, really." Aunt Patty caught Yolena's eye. She didn't say anything, but she didn't look away either. She saw the way Yolena's fingers moved across the keyboard, not with the frantic pace of a subordinate, but with the calculated precision of an executioner. An hour later, Yolena's phone buzzed in her pocket. She stepped out onto the balcony, the sound of the Atlantic crashing against the pilings providing a rhythmic, heavy countdown to the inevitable. "The injunction is signed," Harold Finch said, his voice crackling over the line. The estate attorney sounded almost as satisfied as she felt. "The projector in the ballroom has been hardwired to the secure server we set up. Once you hit the trigger, there's no way for them to shut it down without cutting the power to the entire building." "And the witnesses?" Yolena asked, watching a seagull dive into the gray surf. "The sheriff's department has been briefed on the financial discrepancies. Deputy Marcus Webb will be there in uniform, ostensibly for security, but he's carrying the warrants. The moment the evidence hits that screen, the room becomes a crime scene. Perfect, Yolena said. She felt the heavy weight of the manila envelope in her bag, the original deeds, the forged signatures, the proof of 27 years of theft. 24 hours, Harold. 24 hours, he confirmed. Yolena hung up and looked back through the glass doors. Inside, Diane was laughing, a glass of champagne in her hand as she toasted her own reflection in a gilded mirror. She had no idea the tide was already coming in, and the house she'd built on stolen sand was about to be swept away. Yolena turned back to the ocean, the cold salt spray hitting her face. The warning had been delivered. The arrogance had been confirmed. All that was left was the fall. The evening arrived with a bruise-colored sky that hung heavy over the Atlantic, the salt spray from the churning surf coating the windows of the beach house in a fine, crystalline grit. Yolena pulled her modest sedan into the long, winding driveway of the Outer Banks estate, her headlights sweeping over a line of German-engineered SUVs and Italian sports cars that looked like a row of polished predators. This was the six-car procession Diane had bragged about for weeks, the arrival of the inner circle, the elite few invited to witness the Mitchell family's crowning moment of social ascension. Yolena sat in the driver's seat for a moment, her fingers tracing the smooth, cold leather of the manila envelope resting on the passenger side. Inside were the original deeds, the forensic audit, and the signatures that proved Diane had spent 27 years building a life out of someone else's inheritance. The house before her, a $2.3 million architectural marvel of glass and cedar, was a monument to that theft. It felt less like a home and more like a stage set, glowing with artificial warmth against the darkening coast. She stepped out of the car, the wind whipping her hair across her face. The air smelled of expensive lilies and the sharp, metallic tang of the approaching storm. As she smoothed her tailored charcoal suit, a sharp contrast to the flowing silk gowns she knew would be inside, she saw a familiar figure by the heavy oak entrance. Harold Finch stood near the door, checking his watch. When he saw her, he didn't wave. He simply offered a sharp, singular nod. It was the signal of a man who had already filed the necessary injunctions. The trap was set. The legal machinery was churning in the background, invisible to the laughing guests inside, but as real as the tide. The moment Yolena stepped into the foyer, the sound of a string quartet muffled by the chatter of 30 people hit her like a physical weight. The floors were Brazilian cherry wood, polished to such a high sheen they looked wet. "Oh, look who decided to show up," a voice trilled, dripping with a mock affection that didn't reach the eyes. Meredith Mitchell drifted toward her, clutching a crystal flute of vintage champagne. She was draped in a gown that probably cost more than Yolena's first 3 years of college tuition. She didn't offer a hug. She simply looked Yolena up and down with a pitying tilt of her head. "I'm surprised you found the place, Yolena. I know the GPS can be tricky for people who aren't used to driving this far out on the coast. But don't worry, we've kept the staff entrance clear for the deliveries." The insult was calculated, delivered loud enough for a nearby huddle of socialites to pause and smirk. Yolena felt the familiar heat of a rage spike, but she didn't let it reach her expression. She simply met her half-sister's gaze with a calm that seemed to unnerve the younger woman. "The house is hard to miss, Meredith," Yolena replied, her voice level, "especially when you know exactly whose name is on the foundation." Meredith's smirk flickered, a shadow of confusion crossing her face before she let out a forced, tinkling laugh. "Always so cryptic. Honestly, it's no wonder you never fit in. Why don't you go find Aunt Patty? She's in the sunroom, probably crying over a photo album again. Try not to get any office dust on the upholstery." Yolena moved through the crowd, her heels clicking with a steady, predatory rhythm on the wood. She spotted Richard Mitchell standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the sea. He looked smaller than she remembered, his tuxedo fitting him like a costume he was tired of wearing. He had spent nearly 3 decades watching Diane erase Yolena from the family history, and tonight he looked like a man who finally realized the silence had a price. He caught Yolena's eye and quickly looked away, unable to face the living reminder of his own cowardice. In the sunroom, Aunt Patty was indeed tucked away in a corner, her hands trembling as she adjusted her glasses. When she saw Yolena, she stood up quickly, her face a mask of anxiety. "He's here," Patty whispered, leaning in close. The scent of her peppermint tea was a small comfort in the sea of heavy perfumes. "I saw Marcus Webb in the kitchen. He's in uniform, Yolena. People are starting to ask why the sheriff's department is handling security for a private dinner." "Let them ask," Yolena said softly. She reached into her bag and felt the corner of the envelope. "Is Diane in the dining room?" "She's about to make the toast," Patty said, her voice shaking. "She's gathered everyone. She's going to announce the expansion of the estate, the new wing she's building with the surplus from the trust." Yolena felt a cold, sharp satisfaction. The surplus was the money Diane had skimmed from Yolena's father's accounts for years. It was the final audacity, the peak of a mountain built on lies. She walked toward the grand dining hall. The room was a sea of white linen, silver service, and the soft glow of 100 candles. At the head of the table stood Diane Mitchell. She looked every bit the matriarch, her neck draped in pearls that caught the light with every calculated gesture. She was holding a silver spoon, tapping it against her glass to command the room. The chatter died down. The witnesses, the board members, the local politicians, the neighbors Diane had spent years courting, all turned their attention to the head of the table. "Friends, family," Diane began, her voice projecting with the effortless authority of someone who had never been told no. "Tonight is about more than just a beautiful view. It's about the legacy we build. The Mitchell name has always stood for stability, for growth, and for the preservation of what is ours." She paused, her eyes scanning the room until they landed on Yolena, who was standing at the very back, framed by the dark shadows of the hallway. Diane's lip curled into a tiny, almost imperceptible sneer. "Some people spend their lives trying to tear down what others have built," Diane continued, her gaze locked on Yolena. "They cling to the past because they have no future of their own. But tonight, we celebrate the fact that the rightful owners of this legacy are standing right here." A murmur of agreement went through the room. Meredith beamed from her seat, glancing back at Yolena with a triumphant glint in her eyes. Yolena didn't flinch. She saw Deputy Marcus Webb move into the periphery of the room, his hand resting near his belt, his expression unreadable. She saw Harold Finch step out of the shadows and move toward the sideboard where a laptop was connected to the room's large display screen, intended for a slideshow of the house's construction. Diane raised her glass higher, the crystal shimmering. "To the Mitchell estate, to the truth that always finds its way home." "I couldn't agree more, Diane," Yolena said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the room like a blade. The silence that followed was absolute. Every head turned. Diane's hand froze midair, the wine in her glass trembling. "Yolena, don't be tedious," Diane snapped, her voice sharpening. "If you can't handle a toast without making a scene, you can wait in the car. We have actual guests to attend to." "Oh, I'm not leaving," Yolena said, beginning her slow walk toward the head of the table. She felt the weight of the room shifting, the curiosity of the witnesses turning into a palpable tension. "In fact, I think it's time everyone saw exactly what kind of legacy you've been building." She nodded to Harold. The attorney's fingers moved over the keyboard. The screen behind Diane flickered to life, but it wasn't a picture of the beach house. It was a scanned document, a deed from 1997, with a signature highlighted in a glowing digital red. Diane's face didn't just pale, it seemed to hollow out. The color fled from her cheeks, leaving behind a sallow, gray mask of sudden, piercing terror. Her mouth opened, a small, strangled sound escaping her throat, but no words followed. Yolena stopped 3 feet from her. She could smell the expensive lilies again, but beneath them, she smelled the ozone of the storm finally breaking outside. "The toast was a lovely touch," Yolena said, her voice as cold as the Atlantic. "But you're wrong about one thing. This isn't the Mitchell estate, and you're about to find out exactly who the rightful owner is." The silence in the grand ballroom was so absolute that the low hum of the projector fan sounded like a jet engine. Yolena Carter stood perfectly still, her shadow cast long and dark across the projected image of the 1997 deed. The guests, a sea of silk and tailored wool, frozen with their champagne glasses halfway to their lips. Diane Mitchell didn't just lose her composure, she disintegrated. The mask of the polished Outer Banks matriarch fell away, revealing a hollowed-out desperation that no amount of expensive cream could hide. Her skin turned a sickly, translucent gray, making the heavy contouring on her cheekbones look like streaks of ash. Her eyes, which usually held the room with a gaze of cold iron, were now wide and bloodshot, fixed on the glowing red signature that proved her 27-year lie. A single, frantic pulse throbbed in her neck, visible against the heavy pearls she draped over herself like armor. Her mouth hung open, a silent, trembling O of ruin, as she struggled to pull air into lungs that seemed to have forgotten their purpose. It was the look of a woman who had spent half her life building a fortress on stolen sand, only to feel the Atlantic finally rush in. "That's a lie," Diane finally choked out, her voice a thin, raspy thread. She lunged toward the projector, her designer heels skidding on the polished hardwood. "It's a forgery, Yolena, you pathetic, bitter girl. You think you can just walk in here with a photoshopped document and claim my life?" "It's not her document, Diane," a gravelly voice interrupted. Harold Finch stepped forward from the shadows of the buffet line. He wasn't looking at the guests, he was looking directly at his client. He held a leather-bound folder with the seal of the Dare County Clerk of Courts. "The original is in the county vault. This is a certified copy. Your mother-in-law, Vivian, never intended for this house to pass to you or Richard. She left it to her firstborn grandson, Yolena's father, and upon his death, it passed to his only heir." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Meredith Mitchell stood near the floral arrangements, her face a mask of confusion and burgeoning horror. She looked from her mother to Yolena, her hands shaking so violently that her wine glass rattled against her ring. "Mom, what is he talking about? This is our house. You said Grandma Vivian left it to us in the private will." "She lied to you, Meredith," Aunt Patty said, her voice ringing with a clarity that silenced the murmurs. She stepped out from the cluster of Mitchell cousins, her eyes wet but her chin held high. "I saw the original deed the night Vivian died. Diane told me it was a mistake, that Vivian was confused in her final hours. She threatened to cut me off if I ever spoke a word of it. I've carried that shame for nearly 30 years. Richard Mitchell, who had spent the evening acting as the jovial host, looked as though he'd been struck. He turned to his wife, his face pale. "Diane, you told me the paperwork was handled. You told me the Carter side of the family had been paid off." Diane didn't answer him. She was staring at Yolena with a look of pure, unadulterated venom. "You think you've won? You think you can just kick us out of our home?" "It was never your home," Yolena said, her voice as steady as the tide. She reached into her clutch and pulled out a single, folded sheet of paper. She didn't throw it. She didn't shout. She simply walked over and placed it on the table next to Diane's discarded silk wrap. "This is an order of immediate possession, and that gentleman by the door isn't here for the catering." Every head in the room turned toward the foyer. Deputy Marcus Webb stood there, his uniform crisp and his expression professional. He didn't move, but the heavy click of his utility belt as he adjusted his stance echoed through the vaulted ceiling. The authority he represented was undeniable, a cold splash of reality over the glittering party. "You have 2 hours to pack your personal essentials," Yolena continued, her blue-gray eyes locking onto Diane's. "The locks are being changed at midnight. Anything left behind will be inventoried by Mr. Finch's team and held in storage at your expense." The socialites began to retreat, backing away from Diane as if her sudden poverty were contagious. The sound of shifting feet and hushed, judgmental whispers filled the space where Diane's laughter had dominated only an hour before. "You're a monster," Diane hissed, her fingers clawing at the edge of the mahogany table. Yolena didn't flinch. She leaned in, the scent of the salt air from the open balcony mixing with the metallic tang of Diane's fear. "No, Diane, I'm an accountant, and I've finally finished the audit on your life." Yolena turned her back on the wreckage of the Mitchell legacy. She didn't wait to see Diane's first sob or Richard's collapse into a chair. She walked toward the grand entrance, her heels clicking a rhythmic, victorious beat on the floor she now officially owned. As she passed Deputy Webb, she gave him a single, sharp nod. She stepped out onto the porch, the humidity of the Outer Banks night wrapping around her like a shroud. Behind her, the sounds of the party had turned into the frantic, ugly noise of a family realizing their foundation had turned to dust. Yolena didn't look back. She had a long night ahead of her, and for the first time in 27 years, she knew exactly where she belonged. The salt air didn't cool the fire Diane Mitchell brought onto the porch. For 3 decades, she had moved through the Outer Banks as if the very tides rose and fell on her command. But as she stumbled out of the grand entryway, her heels catching on the threshold of the $2.3 million beach house, that illusion shattered. Diane's face was a map of catastrophic failure. The carefully curated mask of the Mitchell matriarch hadn't just slipped, it had dissolved. Her skin, usually glowing from expensive serums and coastal sun, turned a sickly, translucent gray, like wet parchment left in the rain. Her mouth worked soundlessly, her lower lip trembling with a rhythmic, uncontrolled twitch that made her look decades older than she had 5 minutes ago. Her eyes, normally sharp with judgment, were now wide and unfocused, darting from the legal documents in Yolena's hand to the stoic face of the deputy. Every breath she took was a ragged, audible hitch in her chest, a physical manifestation of the air being sucked out of her world. The arrogance that had been her armor for 27 years had been stripped away, leaving behind a frantic, aging woman who finally realized the ground beneath her was gone. "This is a forgery," Diane hissed, though the tremor in her voice betrayed her. She reached out, her manicured fingers clawing at the air toward the deed. "You've always been a liar, Yolena. Just like your father, you're trying to steal what Richard and I built." Richard Mitchell stood in the doorway, his silhouette slumped. He didn't move to help his wife. He didn't even look at her. He looked at Yolena Carter, his eyes searching her face for the man he had betrayed a lifetime ago. "The audit is complete, Diane," Yolena said, her voice as steady as the lighthouse beam cutting through the dark over the Atlantic. "And it wasn't just about the money. It was about the source." Harold Finch stepped forward from the shadows of the foyer, his leather briefcase clicking open with a sound like a guillotine blade dropping. He handed a single, yellowed document to Deputy Marcus Webb. The paper was crisp, preserved in a safe deposit box that Diane had forgotten existed. "Deputy," Harold said, his tone professional and cold. "This is the original partnership agreement for Mitchell Land Holdings, dated 2 years before Yolena was sent away. It clearly stipulates that in the event of David Carter's death, his 51% controlling interest would pass to a trust for his only biological child. A trust that Diane Mitchell spent 20 years illegally draining to fund this lifestyle." The silence on the porch was heavy, punctuated only by the rhythmic thrum of the ocean. Meredith Mitchell stood behind her mother, her face pale. She looked at the designer wrap on her shoulders, then at the sprawling house, and finally at Yolena. The realization that her entire life of privilege was built on a foundation of theft seemed to settle on her like lead. "Mom," Meredith whispered, her voice small. "Is it true?" "Don't listen to her," Diane screamed, turning on her daughter. The desperation in her eyes was terrifying. "She's jealous. She's always been jealous of you, Meredith, of us." Yolena didn't flinch at the outburst. She felt the weight of the silver locket beneath her shirt, the only thing of her father's she had been allowed to keep. "I'm not jealous, Diane. I'm the owner. Harold has already filed the recovery suit. Every cent you spent from that trust, every mortgage payment on this house, every gift you gave Meredith, it's all being clawed back." Aunt Patty moved through the crowd of lingering party guests who were watching the collapse from the lawn. She walked up the stairs, her gaze fixed on Diane. For years, Patty had been the silent witness, the woman who took Diane's checks to keep the family secrets buried. She stopped next to Yolena and placed a hand on her shoulder. "It's over, Diane," Patty said. Her voice was tired but firm. "I told you when Vivian died that the truth would find a way out. David was a good man, he loved this girl, and you erased him so you could play Queen of the Dunes." "You traitor," Diane spat, but the words had no sting. She looked at Deputy Marcus Webb, her eyes pleading. "Marcus, surely you can see this is a civil matter. We need time to—" "Actually, Mrs. Mitchell," Deputy Webb interrupted, his hand resting on his belt. "Mr. Finch has provided evidence of systematic wire fraud and identity theft. The sheriff is reviewing the warrants as we speak. For now, I'm here to ensure the lawful owner of this property is granted access and that no assets are removed from the premises." He looked at Diane, then at Richard. "I suggest you go inside, pack a single suitcase each, and find somewhere else to stay for the night. This house is being locked down." The face slap was literal in its impact. Diane recoiled as if Webb had struck her. She looked back at the house, the crystal chandeliers, the imported marble, the life she had murdered her conscience to maintain. It was no longer hers. It had never been hers. Yolena stepped closer, the scent of the salt air mixing with the metallic tang of Diane's fear. She leaned in, her blue-gray eyes, David's eyes, boring into Diane's soul. "You told me I didn't belong in this family," Yolena whispered, her voice for Diane alone. "You were right. I belong to the man you robbed, and tonight he's taking it all back." Yolena turned her back on them. She didn't wait to see Diane's first sob or Richard's final collapse into a porch chair. She walked toward the edge of the stairs, her heels clicking a rhythmic, victorious beat on the wood. As she reached the bottom step, she stopped and looked at Harold Finch. "Change the locks, Harold, and start the inventory. I want every piece of jewelry, every car, and every stick of furniture accounted for. If she so much as takes a silver spoon, I want her in handcuffs." She walked toward her modest sedan, parked at the end of the long, shell-lined driveway. Behind her, the lights of the beach house flickered as if the building itself were exhaling. The Mitchell legacy was a hollow shell, and the ghost of David Carter finally had a place to rest. As Yolena pulled away, she glanced in the rearview mirror. She saw Diane Mitchell standing in the glow of the porch light, a small, broken figure silhouetted against a house that was now a prison of her own making. But as Yolena reached the main road, a dark SUV pulled out of a hidden turnoff, its headlights off, following her at a distance that was just a little too deliberate. 6 months had passed since the salt spray of the Outer Banks had been replaced by the crisp, high-altitude clarity of the city. Yolena Carter sat at a corner table in the Gilded Anchor, the very restaurant where, years ago, Diane Mitchell had once told her she looked too common to order the lobster. Today, the scent of expensive saffron and aged oak filled the air, but the smell no longer felt like a barrier. It felt like home. She adjusted the cuff of her silk blouse, feeling the familiar weight of her father's vintage watch against her wrist. It was the only piece of jewelry she wore, a silent anchor to the man whose name she had finally restored. Across from her, Harold Finch was meticulously organizing a small stack of final dissolution papers. He looked up, a rare, genuine smile creasing his weathered face. "The last of the creditors have been satisfied, Yolena," he said, his voice low and steady. "The beach house sale closed yesterday. After the back taxes and the estate penalties Diane racked up, there was just enough left to settle your father's old business debts in full. The Carter name is officially back in the black." Yolena took a slow sip of her sparkling water, the cool condensation a sharp contrast to the heat of the afternoon sun streaming through the window. "And the Mitchells." Harold's expression shifted, a flicker of something close to pity crossing his eyes. "Diane is living in a 2-bedroom rental in a suburb 3 towns over. I believe she's currently embroiled in a dispute with the landlord over the security deposit. Meredith is working behind a cosmetic counter at a mid-tier department store. From what Aunt Patty tells me, the golden child isn't handling the transition to retail hours particularly well." A shadow fell across the table as the restaurant's heavy brass doors swung open. Yolena didn't have to turn around to know who it was. The rhythm of the footsteps was hesitant, lacking the rhythmic click of designer heels that once announced Diane's arrival like a royal fanfare. Diane Mitchell approached the table, and for a moment the room seemed to go silent. The woman who had once commanded every room she entered now looked diminished. Her coat was a beige trench from 3 seasons ago, the hem slightly frayed. Her signature pearls were missing, replaced by a bare neck that looked fragile and lined. Behind her stood Richard Mitchell, looking more awake than Yolena had seen him in 3 decades. "You called us here," Diane said. Her voice, once a sharp weapon of condescension, was now thin and reedy. She didn't sit. She stood at the edge of the table, her fingers twitching toward a chair she no longer had the right to claim. "I thought it was only fair that you saw the final accounting," Yolena said, her voice devoid of the anger that had fueled her for so long. She slid a single sheet of paper across the linen tablecloth. "The estate is closed. The beach house is gone. The Mitchell legacy has been liquidated to pay for the Carter legacy's survival." Diane's eyes scanned the numbers, her face turning a sallow, sickly gray. She looked at the final balance, a string of zeros that represented her life's work of social climbing. "You destroyed everything," she whispered, her gaze lifting to meet Yolena's. "You took a mother's home, you took your sister's future." "I took back what was stolen," Yolena replied. She leaned forward, the light catching the blue-gray of her eyes, her father's eyes. "You didn't lose a home, Diane, you lost a trophy. And Meredith didn't lose a future, she just lost the luxury of being lazy on someone else's dime." Richard stepped forward then, placing a hand on the back of a chair. He looked at Yolena, then at the woman he had spent 27 years humoring. "She's right, Diane, it's over. I've signed the apartment lease in my name only. I think it's time you found a place of your own." The silence that followed was absolute. Diane looked at her husband, her mouth opening and closing like a landed fish. The betrayal from the man she had considered a passive bystander seemed to hit harder than any legal document Yolena had produced. Her hand gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white and bony. "You're leaving me?" Diane's voice cracked. "I'm leaving the lie," Richard said quietly. He turned to Yolena and gave a small, solemn nod. "I should have stood up for David. I should have stood up for you. I can't fix the past, but I won't spend the rest of my life pretending it didn't happen." As Richard led a trembling Diane toward the exit, Yolena watched them go. She felt a surge of the victory euphoria she had imagined, but it was tempered by a quiet, persistent ache. She had won. She had the money, the name, and the justice. But as she looked at the empty chair beside her, she realized that revenge, no matter how justified, couldn't bring back the sound of her father's laugh or the years of warmth she had been denied. Aunt Patty arrived a moment later, sliding into the seat Richard had vacated. She reached across the table and squeezed Yolena's hand. "They're gone, honey. Really gone this time." "I know," Yolena said. She signaled for the waiter, her movements fluid and certain. "By the way," Patty said, leaning in, "Harold mentioned that SUV that followed you the night you left the beach house. He said you were worried." Yolena nodded. "I thought Diane had hired someone." Patty chuckled, a warm, dry sound. "That was Harold's security team, Yolena. He wasn't about to let David's daughter drive off into the dark unprotected. He's had an eye on you since the day you passed the CPA exam." Yolena looked at Harold, who was busy tucking the final check into his briefcase. The realization that she hadn't been as alone as she thought brought a sudden, stinging moisture to her eyes. She blinked it back, looking out the window at the city skyline. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, golden shadows across the street. She had spent so long looking into the past, hunting for ghosts and grievances. But as the waiter arrived with a fresh bottle of wine, the good kind, the kind she now owned the vineyard for, she realized the countdown was finally over. The debt was paid. The table was set. And for the first time in 27 years, Yolena Carter wasn't waiting for the other shoe to drop. She was simply waiting for dinner.
I hope you enjoyed this tale. Please subscribe to support the channel. Goodbye for now.